Friends, how are you doing today? Ask that question to yourself every single day, and I think you will get far in this life. Oftentimes we don't think about it. You may think so, but the reality is your inner self, your conscious, always asks you this every single day. How it is that you are doing. Are you doing okay? Because you can lie to yourself for only so long, friends. You can lie to yourself today, tomorrow, for this past week, maybe this past year. You can lie to yourself. You can ask yourself if you're doing okay and lie to yourself and say you are. But underneath that, we know you're not. And we all have been there. I would say this is a daily struggle every single day, because no matter what happened yesterday, it doesn't mean it's going to transfer over to today. In saying this, friends, I want you to understand that over the span of time, right? Maybe it's today you fool yourself, maybe it's a year you fool yourself, but the actuality is if someone was to look at you today, maybe you look at yourself in 2-3 years from now, where you stand today, you're either going to be surviving, you're going to be living, or you're going to be thriving. Those are the 3 phases in this life. The actuality is all of us at any given point in time are in either 3 of these phases. And today I'm going to break them down, because depending on which phase you're currently in, maybe you want to climb. Maybe you're not okay with where you are. Maybe you know you're not doing too well. Maybe you know where you've been and where you're going. Maybe you know where you've been and where you are. The point is, with these 3 phases, they change. Just because you stay in one today, it doesn't mean you're going to be in it tomorrow. The idea is just to recognize that they exist. And I'm going to break them down one by one at a time. But I feel like it's important to understand. You also have to ask yourself how it is that you're doing. And you got to be honest with yourself. Fully honest. If someone was to look at you, but also if you look at you, where are you in these 3 phases? But let's break it down here, friends. The first one is surviving. So in surviving, friends, this is the very first phase. For a lot of us, it could just be being broke in college. It could be that simple. Before you enter the workforce, this is who you are. You don't have much value. You don't provide much value to society, to the economy, to yourself. Maybe you haven't started a personal development journey. You don't know how good you can be. You don't have much to offer. This can also be surviving. When I think of surviving just in the general sense of adulthood, survival, what does that mean? It means you have limited options. It means you're living a life handed to you. It isn't one you necessarily strove for. It's having a job that necessarily you're not proud of. It's one out of convenience. It's one of survival. You barely have enough money to pay the bills. You're not happy with your current state. You're just taking every single day, one day at a time, in hopes that the next day will be better. But typically in the surviving phase, friends, you can't even think of the next day. You're just living for today, and then tomorrow you live for tomorrow, and the next day you live for the next day. You can't think further than that. You are in a hole, just to put it quite frank. When you're in the surviving phase, you're in a hole. You also are probably in a lot of debt. You're also probably not proud of the body you have, the relationships you have. The inner peace isn't there, the mindset, the mental clarity, it's not there. And in saying that, it kind of correlates with the 5 pillars that I mentioned. In order to master ourselves, we do have to develop them, each and every single one. In the surviving phase, we don't have much of that. We really don't. So the surviving phase is like the base. From here, you go into the next phase, which I'm going to explain is the living phase. But also, just because you're in the living phase, it doesn't mean you can't go back into surviving. It can go vice versa. Just because you're in the surviving phase, it doesn't mean you're going to stay here forever. You can go from this phase into the living phase, or you can stay in this phase so long that you lose all hope and you don't even recognize there's a next phase after that, or you get too comfortable and you don't want to change, whether it's too painful to move or just the convenience of staying here. Sometimes being in this phase, it is something that's powerful. If you fall to this phase, you can then leverage that energy, leverage that pain, and propel yourself upward. Those are like the success stories that you see. But also, being in this phase is not something to look forward to. You don't want to fall here. But some people do use that pain and propel themselves. But some people do fall. This is what you would consider to be rock bottom in this life. So this is the surviving phase. So keep that in mind as we go along here. The second phase is the living phase. So in this phase, friends, again, we're thinking of adulthood. Just all of us being adults in this life. What does that look like? Well, there's the surviving phase. This is now the next phase up from there. It's the living phase. The majority of people are in this phase. When you think of middle class, lower middle class, upper middle class, people who are comfortable in life, they're able to pay their bills, they have a good steady job, they go on vacation sometimes, they carry a little bit of debt, they have that car they want to drive, that family, they're comfortable living in the moment. This is the living phase. This is also a good phase to be in. In comparison to the survival phase, this is the phase you want to be in. When you fall down, that is when you go to the surviving phase. When you climb up, the next phase up is this living phase. Maybe some of the things that I'm saying can kind of resonate with you, but the idea is you don't want to stay in the survival phase for too long. A lot of us start there, whether it's entering the workforce, being a college student who doesn't have much to offer, or it's people who make bad decisions. This is the phase you want to actually be in for the majority of your life. And I would say the majority of people, if you look around, are actually in this phase the majority of their life. But the problem with this phase, friends, and there is a problem, is that you actually get too comfortable being complacent and just living life. You no longer strive for anything better. You're okay being here. You're okay with your job. You're okay with the car you drive. You're okay with the relationships that you've built. You're okay being complacent. And when it comes to the 5 pillars of life, friends, that I said we have to develop and elevate, this is often, like a poisonous pill to take, because you just get stuck here and you don't see anything more. You put blinders on yourself. You don't recognize that because you stay in this phase so long, it actually results in pain again. So we talked about pain in the survival phase, right? It's a very painful state. Some people leverage that pain to elevate. But when you've been in this phase too long, friends, you almost lose hope of anything better, of anything different. You don't recognize the power and the strength in personal development. You're okay being who you are. And in this phase, you often do say, I am who I am. This is who I am. I'm okay here. I don't need to improve anything much. I don't really have too many relationship problems. My car is a nice car. I'll get a new one in 10, 15 years when the other one breaks down. My house is comfortable. We go on vacation. But the reality is, friends, you get very complacent in this phase. And like I said, the majority of people, when you look around, are going to be comfortable staying in this phase. This phase could be the detriment to us in terms of personal development because we think we've made it. And you have. I'll be honest with you. If you stay in this phase for the majority of your life, it's not a bad life. It's a pretty good, solid life. But the reality is, friends, the pain does start to creep in through that complacency. And it's in order to break that complacency where you find that there's more to life. Sometimes there's something in the pursuit, right, as well. There's a lot of value there in trying to be a better person. And that's something I realized over time as I started my own personal development journey. I found myself in the living phase for quite some time early on in my workforce and my career. I mean, I'm still pretty young, don't get me wrong. But the earlier you can recognize this, that being in this level is actually not the greatest thing. I mean, going from lower middle class to upper middle class is still a phase within this own. You're still improving. But the idea should be for all of us to eventually also climb out of this phase. Just like we got out of survival phase, getting into the living phase is also the goal. The objective is to get out of that and go into the next phase. But this next phase, it's actually pretty difficult to get into. And I'll explain why here in a second. So this last phase, friends, phase number 3 is thriving. It is the thriving phase. So we had survival phase, living phase, now we're in the thriving phase. Like I said, this one's a hard one to get into. The majority of people do not make it into this phase. Most of us stay average in the middle class. This is the thriving phase. These are the people that you can tell have won in life. You could just tell. And sure, there's 5 pillars, so in which area did they win in? Well, that's a good question. Sometimes the people that are in this phase only win in one or a few of those areas. They may have a lot of money, but not the relationships. They may have the relationships, but not a lot of money, right? No ability to make decisions, no money to use as a tool to elevate themselves with experiences and things like that. The thriving phase, in general sense, is the people that are winning. You could tell. They got the car they want, they got the money to use as a tool, they got the mental clarity to make decisions, they got inner peace, they got mindset, They have relationships around them. They're just living a more elevated life. If you look around you, friends, if you're likely living in a suburb, you're probably just in the living phase. If you're in the thriving phase, you're probably living in a way nicer neighborhood with a nicer house, driving a nicer car, likely having a better relationship. And there can be some discussions of what this looks like in the thriving phase. It also is very subjective, I will say. What you think is thriving, someone else may not think it is, but it's just in the general sense, friends, an elevated lifestyle. At least from afar, it'll look like you have it all. But just because you get to this phase, it doesn't mean you have it all. This is where personal development is always very, very important. Because what's the next phase after this, friends? Is there is no phase. There is no phase. Other phase from surviving. These are all upward. All of them. They all go up. It's continual improvement. From afar, it may look like you're doing good. You got that car you want to drive. You got the house you want. You have mental clarity to make decisions. But the reality is, friends, in this life, the goal is to go in this sequence: surviving, living, thriving.